Good afternoon and good morning to everybody, and welcome to our webinar on creating a program manager's budget. You are currently all in listen-only mode. After dialing into the webinar, you should have entered in the access code and audio PIN, which are located on your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. It's important that you enter in your audio PIN, as this enables me as your moderator to unmute your line so that you're able to speak on the call. When it's time for questions and answers, you may enter your question into the question box in your control panel, or you can click on the raised hand icon. Please note that we are recording this call, and we will be posting this webinar in a few weeks on the LIHEAP website. My name is Benita Sinaraja, and I will be your moderator from the DEA contracted LIHEAP Technical Assistance Team at Brilliant. And so let's go ahead and get started. So real quick, you may have noticed from the meeting invite, we mentioned that this is a prerequisite for the National LIHEAP Conference. So as many of you know, in a couple weeks' time, we will all be gathered together in DC or in Virginia for the LIHEAP National Conference, May 1st through the 3rd. And there's going to be a number of sessions focused on fiscal management and program operations together. So this is kind of the precursor, and this is to start it all off, how to create a budget. And while we're at the conference, we'll be covering different topics about tracking your budget and adapting to change. But this is definitely the start of it all. So with that, let me turn it over to Tom Reel, who will guide you through the session. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you, Benita. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, we're going to talk today about, as Benita said, creating what we're calling a program manager's budget. And we're going to begin by talking about some budget basics. We'll look at the program manager's budget form that we've devised and look at the functions of the form and talk about some resources and have a Q&A session at the end. First, we want to start with, just budgeting basics and budgeting basics. What goes into a budget? What is a budget? Well, I think these are pretty good definitions that I pulled down off the internet. Basically, a budget, the one point we want to make about the budget is that it's a vital part of your plan. It's an estimate of your revenues and your expenses over a specified period, most likely a year, but as we'll see later, it can be a shorter period of time sometimes. A budget is designed to achieve your objectives, to measure performance in your program, and to actually cope with unforeseeable circumstances, adverse circumstances in your program. Let's look at a few types of budgets, a few approaches to budgets. And most budgets, I think, would fall into the category of just fixed or static budgets. When expenditures are expected to be similar from year to year, a lot of times the budget just remains the same. You sometimes see zero-based budgets, which pretty much start from scratch. And in that kind of a situation, you're going to analyze most every budget category and in terms of justifying the need for dollars to achieve certain objectives in your program. Rolling budgets would be a budget which is adjusted as the year goes by according to circumstances. Activity-based budgets are budgets where the funding is concentrated on areas of the program that have been proven to work for you, so programs and policies that work. And performance-based budgets are more focused on outcomes of services than on based on the inputs of your funding formulas and that sort of thing. So it's a budget that rewards good performance, basically. And we'll look at an example of that later in the webinar. So let's move on and take just a brief poll here. Of those 5 that we've described, what budget approach do you think is most likely in LIHEAP? What budget approach do you use most often in your determining your LIHEAP budget?
Okay, so we'll give everyone a chance to just select their answer. I see responses are coming in. We'll give you definitely another 10 seconds or so. Go ahead and fill in your response, and we will show the results. Okay, looks like we've got a majority have voted, so let me close the poll. And we're sharing our results.
Right. I think that's about right. The fixed and static budget is primarily because LIHEAP is a well-established program. The funding, the revenues are similar from year to year. The amount of money you allocate for a given line item is similar. But I think that what that also says is that maybe we need to look at some possibilities with other budget designs, and maybe at least partially use other approaches, zero-based budgeting or performance-based budgeting, for example. So let's move on then to just one more point I want to make about approaches to budgeting. This goes back to when I was young, many decades ago, but in the 60s in the Department of Defense, the RAND Corporation came up with what now is probably inculcated in all of our budgeting procedures, and that is a program planning budgeting system, which really is based on the fact that budgeted funds drive program policy. They drive program policy towards meeting objectives of your plan. So that's the thing that we want to make sure we get across in this webinar, is that the budget is really your commitment to your plan. And so some of the features of PBS system include, measurements of effectiveness, data systems that at the time in the 60s were relatively new, some of them, in terms of evaluating the program. And it focuses on procedures and processes for planning and timetables. I just wanted to point that out. We'll refer back to that a little later. You might look at budgeting as a cycle where you begin with certain inputs to the budget. You have the process of actually planning and formulating your budget, and then the budget has certain outputs. The inputs are very important in terms of what you see listed there. The people, in other words, the stakeholders in your budget are important. The data that goes into formulating your budget, the time that it takes, the resources, obviously, the funding resources and things that come into the budget, and then your assumptions about the budget categories as you're advising your budget. The process would include planning and proposal. So you're planning and formulating your budget. You're making proposal to whoever needs to approve your budget, and that should be a fairly formal process. The approval then hopefully comes about, and then once that happens, you disseminate your budget to your stakeholders and whoever else is involved. I might add that approval should include also a consensus approval of your stakeholders, and that'd be an important part of that process. Your outputs then would be the implementation of your program based on your budget, the expenditure of funds, and in subsequent sessions we're going to talk about tracking expenditures towards meeting your objectives, and your objectives then would be an output of the budget. So important to all three of these parts, of course, is tracking and monitoring how effectively your budget is performing and how it's coming out. One of the most important parts of this is working together, because you're going to rely as a program manager especially, and if you are looking at your program manager budget, you're going to rely on a lot of different sources of information. Certainly the most important or the most significant is probably your own fiscal division. And so it's important, as we know, that program and fiscal in any agency, whether it's a state agency or a tribal agency or a territory agency, program and fiscal working hand in hand is significantly important in terms of keeping track of your budget and formulating your budget in the first place. So there should be an open communication there. Let's look at a program manager's budget. And what do we mean by a program manager's budget? Well, we mean a budget maintained by the grantee program manager. This is a budget it's at a higher level than the detailed budgets that you might be dealing with your fiscal department or with your subgrantees. This is a higher level budget the program manager uses to control the performance of the program. It should be formal. There should be a formal review process, the review schedule of reviewing your budget quarterly. Is probably the most often used, monthly. You will use inputs from various sources, as we've said. The focus is going to be on key areas of budget control, and we'll talk about that next. What are those key areas of budget control? Then you're going to track and summarize expenditures and obligations against your budget. You're going to evaluate ongoing performance in the program using your budget. And finally, you're going to have to adapt to changing circumstances as you monitor your budget. These last 3 points will be covered more in subsequent sessions than in this session. Let's look at a form that we've devised, and we have an actual Excel spreadsheet that shows a number of budget categories, and we'll get into this in a little more detail, but basically we're going to enter funds into funding amounts into the budget. So our first page on the worksheet is the funding worksheet, and we're going to look at this in terms of how much money we have available for our program. So item 1 there is the LIHEAP block grant itself, and we're entering $75 million for our amount. In our program and our budget here, we have on line item 3 there, we have reallocated funds, reallotted funds, I mean, from the previous year, $31,000. And then at the very bottom, we have carryover funds that we had from the previous year of $3 million. So we're entering that too. These amounts will then be transferred to the main worksheet, the program manager budget worksheet. As you can see at the top in section 1, those amounts were transferred to that, and we'll come back to that a little later. I might mention that worksheet, if it looks familiar, is based on the grantee survey form that you fill out with your funding. So we've used that form because it's familiar to you. Now I'm going to turn it over to John Thompson and from OCS, and John's going to discuss the various kinds of funding inputs that we have, and give a little information about what are the parameters for those funding inputs and definitions and that sort of thing. John, take over.
Thank you so much, Tom, and welcome once again, everybody. Thank you for joining on this webinar. It's good to see such a good turnout prior to our conference that's coming up in the beginning of May. And so why are we all here? We're all here to discuss LIHEAP and what goes, and primarily the program manager's budget and things that go into that. So keeping in that track with the LIHEAP grant, that we released those funds from HHS, and our fiscal year is from October 1st to September 30th. We try to adhere to those dates. I know not necessarily get the funds released out on those dates, but we eventually get those out. And so once they are released, they're distributed in a number of ways. And so one thing with tribes, if tribes are not funded directly from HHS, then usually there's an agreement with the state that the state will have a certain amount set aside after they have distributed the funds within their agency to the tribes. So tribes have an amount that is set aside for them as well. And so we can all work together to distribute LIHEAP out for the purpose that is been set aside for. And so with that, there's also caps that come with that, with those funds, as we call them, government characteristics that these funds come with. And so under that, as most of you on this call probably know, we've talked about this enough, and we've been around speaking about this at numerous speaking engagements that, for example, administrative costs, has a 10% cap. Weatherization has a 15% cap unless you request a special waiver from the government for an extension, which can, not an extension, but an increase, which goes up to 25%, and so forth. Or also how much funds can be obligated in the first year. We say at least 90%, but some agencies obligate 100% in the first year. The key is that with obligating funds that you receive from HHS for LIHEAP, that at least 90% are obligated in the first year, and you're allowed to carry over up to 10% in the second year, but you can certainly carry over less if you have obligated more in the first year. And so HHS, we require revisions that come later, because usually, for example, for carryovers, and we ask for all grantees to submit their estimated carryover report on August 1st. But we're well aware that that is just an estimate, and so we look for the final revision to be done in December. So that is an example of how HHS requires revisions to certain reports. And then we also have reallotment, and reallotments are funds that are distributed out from the previous year's returned unobligated funds. And so those funds are very important, because if a state or agency tribe are not able to use all their funds, we can get those funds together. We have an algorithm that we use here, and then we redistribute those funds back out, and they're used to benefit all the constituents out who use LIHEAP. And also there are also carryover limits that apply as well. Next slide. And so speaking of carryover, we have, you cannot exceed 10%, as we talked about that previously. And so unobligated funds are always carried over from the previous year, and they're included in the final calculation. But we back up there, then you're not to include more than 10% in the final calculation. And so they have to be, when you have your funds that were unobligated in the first year, they must be obligated by the end of the second year. So if you carry over a certain amount of funds, 10% or less, those funds need to be obligated in the second year. And so what do we mean by obligated? Obligated are funds that are used for a specific purpose. So those funds have to have a purpose that they're used for, and they must be tied to that purpose that they've been set aside for and obligated for that purpose. For any future carryover reports, or not reports, amounts, they are not to be calculated in your future amounts that you receive from HHS. So as you see in the final bullet there, that is actually from our LIHEAP statute that we have, or for our assurances that we have as well, that you should not, when you're calculating your carryover report or your carryover funds, not to include those in the calculation of when you receive your new grant from HHS. Next slide.
And John, I'm sorry, if you can just speak up just a smidge. I think it's a little hard to hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Is that a little better?
That's
okay.
Great. Thank you.
My apologies to everybody on the phone. Sometimes I've been told that I have a very soft, soothing voice. So I apologize if I'm not speaking up clearly enough for everybody. I hope that is better for everybody. And so we're going to go into what are two additional type of funding sources that can go into, that can be input into a program manager's budget. One is the emergency contingency funds. Now let me stress right now that contingency funds, they are appropriated from Congress. They haven't been authorized in the last several years. So they only apply to the year when it's appropriated by Congress, and that's by our Commander-in-Chief. And so that has not been done in several years. But when you do receive emergency contingency funds, they do have some properties that go with it. One is the statutory uses. The 10% cap does apply, and they may be carried over as long as they are within the limits of carryover funds. And so it's important to remember those things when you receive or if you receive emergency contingency funds. But as I said before, that has not been authorized for some time. Next slide. Another funding source to consider, or if it is released, is leveraging incentive rewards. And so once again, I want to stress that HHS has not announced the availability of this program for a while as well, so actually the last several years. And so any leveraging set-aside dollars are included within the grantees block, the block grant allocation that is sent out. And so these are the leveraging activities are outlined what they can be used for, but since right now it's not really something that is relevant right now, you don't really have to worry about leveraging funds, incentive awards, but if they are released, you will receive all the guidelines of the activities that they can be used for. Next slide. And
okay,
at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tom right now.
All right, thank you, John. Appreciate it. So we entered the dollar amounts for our funding as we see in these screenshots, and they transferred to the section 1 of the program manager's budget. So next, we want to turn to budgeting for our expenses. And we want to begin by talking about what are the broad areas of budget control that the program manager needs to keep track of. What are the areas that you as a program manager need to control? And we're going to do this as a chat question again. And Benita, what do they need to do for that?
Oh, sure thing. Well, we'd love to hear from all of you. If you can just type your, your suggestions in the questions box, that'll come through in the chat pane for me here in the control panel, and I can let Tom know what you're thinking. So feel free to just type in, and any idea, I won't call anybody out. It can be anonymous. What do you think might be some broad areas that we should be thinking about? So go ahead and type that in, and we'll give everybody a few seconds to be able to type to do that.
Yeah, I think we want to make sure that we think in terms of, as a program manager, what are the areas that could get out of control? What certainly, like administration would be an area that you want to want to control. I think that'll probably come up.
That definitely has. We've got some great ideas coming in. Some folks have said staff costs, crisis allocation, salaries again, subgrantee activities, benefits, office supplies, definitely something you have to think about, weatherization allocation, IT costs, number of families we are wanting to serve and paying attention to that payroll. We've got a lot of great thoughts, serving the elders and families with children, vendor payments, direct benefits, definitely administrative funds. Numerous people have said that. Assurance 16, serving the respective region in the plan. Assurance 16 not exceeding 5%, direct assistance, heating and cooling. When remaining, let's see, this last one is when remaining allotments will be received impacts our budget. True. Average heating benefits. These are great. Thanks, guys. This is awesome.
Certainly are. Well, because we had to think about it ahead of time, we did come up with a list of our own, but I think all of this fits in there, and that's real good discussion. And if this looks familiar, this list of broad categories, it's because basically these are the categories that you report in your model plan: administration, carryover, assurance 16, leveraging, and then the benefit categories. And so what do we need to look at when we establish these broad categories? Of course, we had to do this ahead of time because we have our budget worked out this way. We could have gone a little bit differently, but I think we'll cover most of what I heard in that list. Well, in these budget categories, we certainly will then, once we have established the budget, we want to look at the budgetary limits. So we want to keep track of administration in terms of what we've said we're going to spend on administration. A number of our categories, as we know, have statutory limits. So we're going to need to keep track of those, the money spent against the budget in terms of those statutory limits. And then there are a number of areas that I think have some performance aspects to them that we also want to check on. Some of this in terms of tracking we're going to get into in subsequent sessions, but we'll see how it relates as we go through and fill out the budget forms. So let's move on then to the budget form again in terms of planning, or in terms of administration. That's our first broad category, administration, and there are a few things we need to consider when we're talking about what goes into administration. One of the major points of emphasis that we all talk about a lot and need to keep in mind is that your definition as a grantee, your definition of administration is what applies to your money. Now, that doesn't mean you could just choose anything. There are some regulatory aspects to that definition. For example, one of the regulations indicates that your administration should be defined in terms of functions you normally associate with the administration of any public assistance program that you operate. Or let's say in the case of a tribe, your definition of administration should be consistent with your overall tribal fiscal policies definition, so that there is some rationale for the definition. Another aspect of this that's important is that administrative expenditures apply at every level of the program. So it's not just the grantee's administrative costs, it's all the subgrantee administrative costs. It's the administrative costs that a weatherization agency might incur. All of that counts in terms of fitting within that definition of administration. And it also all counts in terms of the use, or in terms of the statutory limit on the use of funds for administration. So we can see here that administration is computed two different ways. The state, a state grantee receives 10% of the funds payable, can use that amount for administration. With the tribes and territories, the formula is a little bit different, as you can see read it there. I'll note that on our program manager's budget form, which we'll go back to in a few minutes, the amount is calculated for administration one of these two ways, depending on the version of the form. So we have a state version, and then we have a version for tribes and territories. But again, let me emphasize the need then to work with your fiscal department, with your legal departments, with your state agency in terms of your definitions for administration. And then you also need to think of what goes into administration. On the next slide, let's make that point one more time in terms of you as a program manager have the responsibility to know your official definition of administration and what is included in that, what kind of costs. Somebody mentioned a while ago the various staff costs, position costs. Those obviously you need to know what kind of costs are in your definition of administration, and what is the source of that definition? Is it your tribal or state agency policies? You need to know that. And then what are the specific costs? For example, at a grantee level, your program director, your policy consultants, your program monitors all probably would be examples, and then all the associated or indirect costs with that. At a subgrantee level, program supervision, you need to determine what to do in terms of the cost of intake and eligibility staff, for example, or other support staff, and again, associated costs to that. So as we go into completing the section on administration in our budget, we're going to ask a basic question, and the question is, and we'll chat about this a minute, is what are some of the specifics that go into, we got into this a little bit, but what are some of the specifics that go into determining how much money you need to put into administration? As a program manager, what are you going to add in for administration? Or what do you add in terms of your actual budget?
So again, we ask you to definitely participate and type it in your control panel, the answer to that. What are some questions that you should be asking when determining your budget for administration? So we'll give everybody a few seconds to type that in. We're getting some ideas, Tom, about payroll cost and fringe, grantee and subgrantee administrative allocations, program development and planning costs, rent, that's for sure, utilities, salaries, how many employees you have, definitely taking that into consideration, printing, training,
Great.
Definitely a good thing to think about, service of the clients, for sure. There's no wrong answer, definitely this is an open brainstorm. We've got a few more ideas coming in. Budget ceiling, oh, that's a good question. Equipment. Can I hire more people? I think a great question that we all want to think about all the time. And I think that's about it right now. Thank you, everybody, for some. Oh, and travel. Great. That's a great point too. Is there any travel, like coming to the National LIHEAP conference, for example? So
travel. Yes, that's right. That's right. Well, and we came up with similar ideas, and I think in a more general way, you've come up with a lot of very specific costs that would go into it, which, that's exactly what we're driving at. And so much of this, as we go through each of these, is going to revolve around positions and then associated costs to positions. Somebody mentioned rent and, all the other overhead costs. So let's go back to our spreadsheet and actually enter a dollar amount. Obviously, we've assembled all those costs, we've added it up, and we've said that at the grantee level, and we'll look in section 2 there, we are going to enter costs, and Benita, I think you have that number, I think, 800,000. And you'll see on our budget form then, to the left of that number, just as a cue, the calculation is made, not on the other side, to the left, of the 10% of funds payable. So you could enter in administration as much as $7.5 million. Of course, this is just at the grantee level, so you're entering 800,000, and then it tells you on the form that that's 1.1%. So you enter some of your money. We go back to the slide with kind of a little screenshot of that. And you can see a little better what I'm talking about in terms of that. Now let's go on. Okay, our second broad category that we were looking at is Assurance 16. This was mentioned in our discussion earlier. And again, we're going to ask the same question over and over about each category. What, as a program manager, would you need to determine in terms of assembling your high-level budget, your overall budget for Assurance 16? Well, as we go to the next slide, we'll see again a similar list. But there is one point I want to really make here, and that is, again, calling back the PPBS system and the tie between program planning and budgeting. This is an example of where it's so important that you have an Assurance 16 plan design in place before you can really determine what kind of staff costs, for example, you're going to have with that. And so that's an important part of assembling the dollar cost for your high-level budget here. And as we'll see, that includes Assurance 16 costs both at the grantee level and at the subgrantee level. So we'll go back to our Excel form, and we'll enter a dollar amount for Assurance 16. And we've decided that at the state level, we need $100,000 to administer Assurance 16. Again, to the left of that number, it's given us just as a guideline the 5%, so we know how much money we have to spend. And on the right, it's told us how much we've spent so far. And again, you can get a little better view of that here. We did add a line item here for what we call non-administrative costs. And again, let's recall that our definition of administration is our definition. And so there might be some costs, some staff costs or other kinds of costs that within your definition do not count as administrative costs. So we have a line item for that, and we're not going to put any dollars in that line item for our budget, but a dollar amount could be put in there. And then again, I would emphasize that dollar amount, you can see it on the screenshot next, where we've just have no dollars, but I would emphasize that dollar amount, would need to be clearly defined in terms of your definitions of administration and non-administrative costs. Now we move to another important area, and we've talked a little about this in John's presentation, and that is carryover. We've put in a line item in your program manager's budget called planned carryover, and that's because there are a number of agencies that indeed plan to carry over funds. And let's ask ourselves first why we would plan to carry over funds. And I think that on the next slide we can see that the main reason that I've seen anyway, and yet that any of you carry over funds on purpose, is that you want to have some funds available at the beginning of the next year in case there's some delay in federal funding, so that you can get the program started at the right time the next year. And I think that's primarily the reason funds are carried over. You might, though, budget funds in this category for a couple of other reasons. One would just to be to have some unobligated funds that you might plug into categories later. So the other thing that I think this does is it prevents you, it emphasizes the need for tracking your unobligated funds and making sure that you know how much of your funding is unobligated at any time during the year. Remember that reporting on unobligated funds comes up pretty early. It comes up in August. So you need to really keep track all along as to how much is unobligated. This is another area where it's important that you work with your fiscal people to make sure you know that. So as we ask ourselves the same question, what are the factors that go into planning your carryover? Well, obviously, it's what we just talked about. What is the reason for leaving some funds unobligated? What dollar amount is to be set aside at the beginning of the budget? Obviously, you want to make sure you're within the 10% limit. Will you have funds available then? We're going to talk about some situations in subsequent sessions in terms of what might come up later in the year that results in unobligated funds. And so we urge you to really not try to hit that 10% cap in terms of unobligated or plan to carry over. And again, very important to work with your fiscal people on that. Let's go to the Excel spreadsheet again, and we'll enter a dollar amount. We're planning in our budget here to carry over $5 million. Now, when I say that, we might be planning to carry it over, or we might just be saying we have $1 million we want to leave unobligated and for contingencies that come up later in the year and plug into elsewhere into the budget later in the year if they come up. So as we look at the screenshot again, you see again the limit is shown to you automatically in the program, and how much you've put in the unobligated funds is shown to the right of the dollar amount, and then it also gives you a little note that yes, that is within the available amount of money, in case you couldn't see that just in terms of the numbers, and tells you what the variance is there. Another broad category that we identified is the weatherization program, and we ask ourselves the same question: what are the details? And I think in any of these, then the details are going to come back to what you answered in our first broad category. It's going to revolve a lot about around the cost of staff, the cost of positions, the associated costs. And when I say that, I mean all of the indirect costs, all of the overhead type costs that you have, and at every level, as you pointed out in that chat, at every level of the budget, the grantee level and the subgrantee level, and the weatherization contractor level. So again, recall that it's important that you have a plan together that's designed for your weatherization program. Before you start to look at the costs, you need to have a pretty firm idea. You're probably going to start with the percentage of funds that you want to put in weatherization, and then look at the dollar amounts available for administration at all levels. There are a few other little budgetary aspects to this. I'm not sure little is the right word because they're very significant. One is that you probably want to look at weatherization in terms of limits on the dollars that you put into any given unit. So at the DOE weatherization program uses an average cost per house. You could use an average or a maximum cost per house in terms of LIHEAP dollars. That way you can plan how much money and then how many units you're going to be able to serve in terms of weatherization. So let's return to our program manager's budget. As I said, we'll start with a percentage because I think that's what most people do. And in the budget, we've put in 11%, and voila, it comes up with our total dollars that we're using, which is 11% of the funding. And to the left, again, it's giving you, the amount that is available, the 15%. Now we realize that with a waiver, you can go up to 25%. That's not currently programmed into the spreadsheet, but it could be, and if in situations where that's necessary. The other thing that, as I mentioned, you need to do in terms of the weatherization section of the program manager's budget is then enter dollar amounts for administration. And we've got weatherization grantee administration, that would be state level administration, and then their sub-grantee administration of the program, and we're entering dollar amounts for that. And so again, that gives us the totals. When we look at the screenshot, you can see that the calculations are made by the program in terms of whether you're within the allowable amount and how much you're spending overall. So that's a nifty little calculation of the program. Well, we've gotten through quite a few budget categories here, and again in our chat session, which was really useful a while ago, there was a number of people mentioned subgrantees, and we're going to need to budget the same categories in terms of subgrantees, but I thought maybe we divert just a little bit, a few minutes, and talk about subgrantee budgets. Obviously, each of you has a budget form of some sort that you use with your subgrantee that's going to give you information about their administrative costs, their other costs that you want to know about. And again, I think as 46% of you pointed out, in terms of the type of budget that you normally use, it's usually a fixed or static budget because a lot of things seem to stay the same from year to year. I would submit, though, and I've seen a couple of grantees that at least partially use a zero-based budgeting system, where they ask, rather than top-down providing the dollar amount and having the subgrantee propose then a budget within that dollar amount, they basically ask the subgrantee, what do you need to serve your target number of households? Well, first of all, what is your target number, and what do you need to serve that number? And they let the subgrantee then, bottom up, if you will, in budget talk, propose a dollar amount. Now, obviously, all that has to be adjusted in terms of the dollars available, but they're beginning a little more on a zero basis. What I wanted to mention is looking at, on the next slide, looking at maybe some sort of performance basis for your subgrantee budgets. Now, subgrantees are going to need a certain level, a base level of administrative funds, and that ought to be allocated in whatever formula way you do that. But it's possible, and I've seen a few performance-based budgets, to maybe devise a budget where at least some of the funds are performance-based. And let's look at an example. It's a pretty straightforward example, but let's say, no, back to the previous slide there, Benita. Let's say as a grantee, we have 100,000 households we want to serve, and we're going to set $1.5 million aside as performance dollars, for administrative performance dollars. Our subgrantee A normally serves 10,000 households, so that's their target. That's 10% of our households, so we're going to allocate 10% of the funds available to them on performance basis, 150,000. So subgrantee B normally serves 7,000, which is 7% of our households, so we're going to allocate 7% of the money, 105,000. Now let's go to the next slide and see how they perform. Let's look at subgrantee A first. So subgrantee A goes along reporting their households served. In the first quarter, they served 2,000 households, or 20% of the households. So at that point in quarter one, they have $30,000 available in performance admin dollars, 20% of their 150,000. And similarly in 2 and 3, they were going down reporting. In quarter 4, at the end of the fourth quarter, we find that they've served 9,300 households. Well, that falls short of their households served, so they've only served 93% of their target number. So that is $139,500, rather than that's then becomes the dollar amounts available to them under the performance-based administrative dollars, $139,500. Now, subgrantee B, on the other hand, has a good year, and of course their target is 7,000, and you can read down what they report each quarter till at the end of the year. They have 7,800 households that they've served, 800 more than their target, or 111%. So their available funds are 111% of the funds that they started with, or 116,550. Now, this is a very simplified, straightforward example, and obviously there's a few things that would have to be a part of this. One is that subgrantee B, in order to claim that amount of money, does still have to have administrative costs for that amount of money. They're not getting a bonus; they're just getting a higher dollar amount available to them. And there would also, of course, have to be the caveat through it all that it's subject to the availability of funds. In a way, in our example, we're relying on subgrantee A to fail a little bit so we can reward subgrantee B. But it allows us to move administrative funds where they're of the most use. And so I think it's a legitimate way to look at performance basis in terms of at least some of the dollars that you use. Anyway, we'll go back to our pattern here a little bit and talk again about the subgrantee budgets and what are the factors that go into determining that. And again, on our list that we came up with, it's very similar. We're going to have to look at the costs and perhaps the costs that they propose to us as much as the costs that we allocate to them. And we'll have to look with the subgrantee at every cost that we've discussed so far: administration, assurance 16, non-administration if that applies, and in the end total it all up to put into our spreadsheet, which we'll do now. And we've got the money that we've determined. We've already set up this budget, of course. So we can see that administration, the available amount is $5,953,000 to the left of the figure, but we only figured out that we needed only $5,653,100. So we're not spending all our administration. That's fine. that's what we needed there. Same with Assurance 16, we calculated that among all the subgrantees, we needed to allocate $2.5 million. And again, we're not going to put anything in the non-administrative category for this. So you can see a little clearer in the spreadsheet, in the screenshot there. So we've looked at all our we've entered dollars into our non-benefit categories, and it's time to make some decisions before we go into talking about benefits. We need to look at our numbers. We need to do as our friend here has advises. Is there a way that we can afford what we've budgeted for? And let's look at the summary on the spreadsheet itself and talk about once the money is budgeted in the spreadsheet, the bottom section is going to show the totals. And you can see this is the total of all we call the non-benefit totals. This doesn't have anything to do with benefits yet, but administration is all added up from above. And you can see we're well within the 10%. We're at 9.6%. And so the note tells us we're within available dollars. Same with carryover, same with Assurance 16. So we did a pretty good job of budgeting there. We might want to review our dollar amounts above and see that does this look like reasonable dollars for the budget. Now, what happens though if we go back? We got a screenshot of a previous budget where, as you can see, we had a little problem, and we're fine in Assurance 16 category. We're fine in carryover. We still have some money available if we need it in our planned carryover. But with administration, we've calculated through the program that we've budgeted 10.5%. So we're already starting out of compliance with our statutory limit. But of course, we don't want to be there. So we're going to need to go back and trim someplace. So what do we do? Well, here's some ideas. I mean, obviously, we're going to need to go back into each of those budget categories. We're going to particularly look at administrative funds at the grantee level, in the weatherization program, grantee funds at the subgrantee level, and start trimming back. We have, as you can see at the top, we have $346,900 variance that we need to get rid of. So we're going to need to cut some administrative costs someplace. Well, what are we looking for? Well, again, I think we might be looking at going back to our program definitions for administration and saying, okay, of all of the position costs, for example, I've applied to administration, are there any of those that under our definition don't fall into administration? Are they non-administrative costs? And I think then another area is look at Assurance 16 versus administration. This is probably the most fruitful area because a lot of times I think some staff costs that may be charged to Assurance 16 get charged to administration because it's just simpler to do. If you have a staff person who is doing both intake and you count that as an administrative function, and then that person is also doing some budget counseling, which you count as Assurance 16, you have to set up some way that you're through time studies or something, you're dividing that salary up. So sometimes your tendency is to just not do that and just charge it all to administration. So you want to look at things like that in terms of finding that $346,900 savings. So presumably we have done that, and at the bottom of this slide you can see that we did a great job and we finally balanced that budget, so we can move on from there. We've gotten all our non-benefit budget dollars budgeted, and as you know, you do that, and then what do you use for benefits? Well, it's basically the remainder, right? So we're going to look at budgeting for the 3 different types of benefits: heating, cooling, and crisis. Heating being the primary benefit, the primary dollars that go for energy assistance benefits in our example. There are obviously some states that and areas that where cooling is a higher number, but the principles will all be the same. Crisis, again, look at the dollars you spent in previous years, and remember that crisis is the only benefit really that has a statutory limitation to it, and that is that crisis money must be available in a reasonable amount through March 15th of each year. So in another session, we're going to look at tracking that a little bit to make sure that those crisis dollars are still available all the way through March 15th. So again, we'll go back and ask the same question in terms of what we need to look at in determining benefits. Here, I don't really have anything but just to go back to the form and say, how many dollars do we have available for benefits? And you can see our form tells us that at the top it says available $55.7 million. That's basically calculated from subtracting all of our non-benefit dollars from the total money we had available. So that tells you how much you can put into these three benefit categories. I think it's smart to start with the bottom two categories, which would be the lower dollar amounts. Again, with crisis, we were entering $4 million based on what we've spent in the past years, and that's the dollar amount. In cooling, we're entering $3 million. Now, some of you might not have any cooling program. Some grantees don't run one, but we're going to put that in here in terms of our example. Now, you might have noticed that as we put dollars in here, the amount up at the top or at the in that box where it says available has reduced by the dollars that we've assigned to crisis and cooling. So what money is left for heating assistance? Well, of course, it's the remaining available funds, and we'll put in the 48 million, and you'll notice that those available funds then equal zero. Not only that, you'll notice if we go back over to section 1 that we get a 0 at the bottom of section 1, and it says budget balance, because obviously we used all of the rest of the funds for heating assistance. Had we just put in 48 million, these two amounts would show up as 724,490, the remainder of our funds. So that's how the program manager's budget form is used, and hopefully gives you some information about how in this discussion how we determine what the dollar amounts are that go into this program manager's budget, this higher level budget. We'll turn to one other aspect of the budget, and as we say, I think the program, the program plan that you have in place is driven by your budget towards certain objectives that you have, and there may be a number of those objectives. But to me, what is the primary objective? The primary objective is serving households with benefits. And the primary objective is usually can be quantified in a number of households you want to serve. So we have in the form a way of projecting that. We'll look at, if you move that over just a little bit, yeah. Basically, all we're going to do here is enter our prior year's average benefit for each of these categories. So in heating, our prior year average benefit was $439. How do we know that? We know that, of course, from our performance reports from last year. We know what we spent per household. In cooling assistance, I think we $75, and in crisis assistance, what did we put in there? $204. So these were the dollar amounts that we got from our performance reports. And what does that do? Well, the dollar amounts that we put in there, let's see, the $439 gets divided into the heating assistance dollars and projects then that with that amount of money, you're going to serve 110,990 households. Also gives you a projection on cooling assistance and on crisis assistance. Is this exact? Of course not. I mean, average benefits can vary from year to year, but it gives you a target. It gives and it gives you a point of comparison. So let's look at how we analyze that a little bit. Basically, I think we could ask ourselves three questions, and the first question is, how do these projected household numbers compare with your prior year? So we've seen that, you know, you're likely to, your target's going to be 110,990 households. Is that a lot more than last year? Is that a lot fewer? Is it a similar number to last year? And secondly, the second question is, if it is different, especially if it's fewer households served, what is the reason? Was there an overall reduction in funding? Or was the amount of funding that you ended up with in terms of the dollars for heating benefits, let's say, was that less than you had in heating benefits last year? If so, do you need to go back to those non-benefit categories? Or are there some things in those non-benefit categories that maybe you can't afford? Maybe you can't expand your weatherization dollars and still serve the same number of households as last year. Maybe you can't change that Assurance 16 program and put a little more money into it, and at the cost of serving the same number of households as you did last year. So these are all things that you do as in analyzing the information that this program manager's budget is giving you. If the program's goal is to stay the same, you know, what budgetary steps are to be taken, basically. So that's a little extra feature too that we added into the program. I guess just in summary, Benita, you know, well, let me point out that we've got a little list of these are the functions of the program manager's budget, and of that calculator, that spreadsheet form, just to list out. Let me just point out one thing here in terms of protect and unprotect. You can do it at your own risk, because, you know, the calculations are all tied to each other. So, but I do give you the password to unprotect the form if you want to make changes to it. So in summary, I think that as we've completed the dollars available, and we've looked at the budget categories and made sure that all those dollar amounts are within the statutory limits, I think we've devised a well thought out budget. We've constructed a budget that complies with all the LIHEAP rules and regulations in terms of the budgetary limits. But even more than that, I think as we've thought through what goes into determining the dollars in those budget categories, we've come to understand the reasons behind our budget. What are the reasons why are we putting this much money into Assurance 16? It's because we want to affect certain outcomes in that part of the budget. And so our budget is driving our plan and towards the outcomes that we desire. I think that's about what I have, Benita.
All right. Thank you very much, Tom. So as a reminder, we have some great sessions coming up at the conference. I know some of you may not be coming to that, but the conference materials will be available after the conference, certainly on the website for everybody to reference. And we hope that today a lot of you, not only the program staff, but our fiscal staff are attending this webinar today. And if not, this webinar will be posted in about a month or so on the LIHEAP website, so your team can access this information and listen to it when they're able to. But we do have a lot of focus at the conference about fiscal and program partnership, and Tom referenced it a few times, but so today was all about creating the budget, from the get-go, but there's a lot of things that you need to do to be tracking it throughout the program year, and we're going to talk about that. And then also what happens when there's a wrench in your plan and you need to change your budget. So we're going to definitely talk about that at the conference, and this is that info. It's May 1st to the 3rd. Be sure to register if you have not already. We are very excited to see all of you there. And just wanted to include that we do have some budgeting resources. These are in the slides for all of you, so you will be able to access that as well. So with that, we do have some time, and we wanted to open the floor up for questions. So if your team has any questions, you know, program and fiscal staff, everyone is welcome to ask. We definitely want to open up the floor now. You can, as a reminder, ask your question into the control panel, or you can click on your raised hand icon and I can unmute your line when it comes time for that if you would like to ask a question. Okay. So it looks like we We have a few questions coming in, I think, as we were kind of going through this. And I know, okay, it looks like some folks have asked about, can I post a link for the slides? We will make sure that it's okay with our OCS team, and we will send you the worksheets, the state and tribal worksheets, and the slides for everyone. So if you attended today, thank you, and we will make sure that we send out the slides to all of you who have registered. Does anybody have any questions on the budget right now? The floor is open for remaining time. Tom, we are getting a few thank yous from some of the folks on our call, and we're happy to do this. And for those of you who are asked about, can you get a copy of that worksheet, we will be sending that out. We'll send out the worksheets and these slides to everybody. There's one good clarifying question that a previous participant asked, and I think for Tom and John, this would be helpful for other folks to hear. Let me just pull it back up as we've got some things coming in. The amount for weatherization grantee administrative cost cap. Well, let me ask this again. The amount for weatherization grantee administrative costs is capped at 10%. Do the amounts of weatherization and LIHEAP grantee administration costs each have a cap of 10%? And I apologize, that's how the person wrote it, so I know that may not be as totally clear.
No, I think you as a grantee might set your own percentage. What's important is that the dollars that the weatherization grantees use, LIHEAP, I'm talking about LIHEAP dollars, of course, that they use for administration, those dollars count in your 10% cap. So whatever dollar amounts you allocate to them, and usually that is more often, I think, at that point done by dollar amounts. That could be converted to percentages of their grant and that sort of thing. But those dollar amounts then need to be included in terms of the 10% cap. Did I say that right, John? I hope so.
Okay, yeah. And just to elaborate a little further on that, it's important to remember that these caps that we have, they're all part of the 90%. And so, you know, within the overall 90% of your budget, you have 10% that is allocated for administrative. You have 15% that is up to 15% that can be allocated for weatherization. You have up to 5% that can be allocated for assurance 16. So it's those things you have to remember, and that all fits in within the realm of the 90%. And so you have to remember that. I know it may sound confusing, but keep in mind when we say the one motto that I have is just try to keep things simple. So you remember, the first thing remember about LIHEAP funds is that you have to obligate up to at least 90% of your funds in the first year. But within that 90% falls different amounts that have this statutory caps, as I spoke about earlier when I was speaking about each part of LIHEAP. And then, you know, as you know, there's crisis provisions that you can build into your budget as well. So there's different things that you can, not different things, but there's caps that go within for those categories, but it all falls within up within your budget, which can be obligated at least 90%, but you can certainly obligate more than 90% in the first year of your allocation. So I hope that's clear as well with what Tom said.
Okay. Thank you very much. Another question that we got is, what do people use the other non-admin budget for? Will that category be in the available state plan? I'm not sure if I totally Doug, if you want to offer if you want to type in a clarifying question, just clarify that question a bit, I can definitely throw that back up to our speakers. One other person asked, do you track subgrantee budgets on a per invoice basis, meaning keeping them under the caps based on what they have spent so they don't exceed the caps if they don't spend all of their funds?
Okay. If I think I understand that correctly, the track subgrantee expenditures.
Budgets on a per invoice basis.
Okay, budgets on an invoice basis. Well, let's go back to the whole. Well, I don't want to delve too far off topic, but this goes into the organization of the subgrantee, and so I don't, states are have different level of involvement with their subgrantees. Ultimately, they are their own entities, and they should have a devised way of accounting within their agency, how they track their transactions. Can't specifically tell them how to do their accounting of transactions, just like we at the government can't do that with our partners. So we just check to see if there is a viable way of how transactions are being tracked. And so if you look at it from that standpoint, on an invoice level, if that is the way that you want to track and keep your subgrantees, if you think that is an effective way of keeping your subgrantees, of helping them monitor their transactions, looking at it on the invoice level, then that's something for you to discuss with them. However, I can't say that is that is the catch-all method to do that. But that's certainly something that if it would help as far as reporting purposes, then it probably would be, a recommended idea.
And if you have kind of specific questions like that, feel free to reach out to your OCS regional liaison, and they can also put you in touch with John and Iris to have kind of more of a fiscally focused conversation too.
Benita, in terms of the category non-administration, again, administration, the definition is up to the grantee. And you'll recall that one of the regulations indicates that in general, the grantee's definition ought to follow the definition and other public assistance programs that the grantee operates. Well, for example, some state grantees might use the definitions that are delineated in the TANF regulations. Well, TANF identifies, certain types of activities, say with intake workers as administration, but certain types of case management activities, just as an example, as not being administration. They don't say what it is, but they say it's not administration. So, if you were following those definitions, you might have some costs that are not administration. In terms of where it is, it's not a category in the model plan, but those dollars are just program dollars, so they're all added up into the program dollars. So that would be the one example I could think of there.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. We did get some clarification from Doug. Thank you, I think, on what he was trying to ask about what do people use the other category budget for, or that there is no quote unquote other category to complete your budget when you're doing, this is for a state plan, to budget 100% of your funds. I think you may say that it's program services. So I think Doug was wondering, will there be this category available to put in these other services to make it equal 100%? Hopefully I'm saying that right, Doug.
yeah, I don't know, John, whether you
I don't know,
have
John, if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, the reason why I didn't jump in, I thought if I'm not mistaken, that question was pertaining to using the budget model. If there's something built in to use 100% on the budget model.
Right.
So as far as the budget model is concerned, we HHS was not the owner of the model, but if there's something that can be built into the model that was used today that would allow to use 100% of the funding, then since that is something that is permitted under LIHEAP guidelines, that you are allowed to use up to 100% of your funding in the first year, it's something that should be permitted as far as using the budget model.
I see,
so
yeah.
Okay. Doug, is that address what you were saying? Were you referring to the budget model that was used today in the presentation?
He was talking about the LIHEAP state plan. So maybe, Doug, let's follow up offline to make sure we can appropriately address that question.
Yeah, yeah.
And we did receive some feedback, of course. I realized that we used the state worksheet today, but of course this session is for all of the grantees, states, tribes, and territories, and most of the categories do apply to all of you. And so I know we didn't show the tribal worksheet. We do have that available, and we will send it out. So, and I don't know, Tom, if you have any other comments about, because I know we didn't use an example for a tribal grantee today, but this certainly, a lot of this content definitely does apply to the tribal grantees as well.
Right. The budget form itself, the difference is that it doesn't have a place for subgrantees because I don't think there are any in that situation. And then the calculation of the administrative cost is based on the formula that we're all familiar with in terms of, 20,000 or less is 4,000, and then there's a different part if it's over 20,000. So the formula is built into the tribal territorial version to compute the same way, but using that formula instead of the 10%.
A great point, and thanks for bringing that up, because we definitely want this. This is meant to be helpful for everybody. One other question we got was, how much do we need to spend on energy assistance? 70%, 90%?
That would be a good discussion, a good chat discussion. I don't think there's a rule about it, is there, John?
No. No, there's no provision of how much to spend on energy assistance. So, but definitely, I would encourage you that we could have an off discussion with our with your program liaison and with us as well at the HHS to help you figure things to get an accurate, whatever is suitable for your agency in addressing the needs of the public. I would encourage
based on the local needs, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
One point we were trying to make here is that maybe what you need to ask instead is how many households do we want to serve? I mean, that's really the most direct objective. And do we want to maintain a level of service at a certain number, especially if funding has not changed that much? Is there any reason to reduce that number, or do we even want to aim towards increasing that number? We will get into some of this in the subsequent sessions too, I think.
And that applies to tribes as well, right, Tom? Would that be a recommendation to think about household service?
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. I mean, there might be other objectives to your program for sure. And for example, in Assurance 16, there certainly are other objectives with what you're trying to accomplish with working with families. But bottom line is, are we serving at least a respectable target number of households? And I think that's something that you need to look at, evaluate.
Absolutely. this question, so the admin is a rule of 10%. And that's all I wrote. Maybe John,
it's
do you want to,
10%
or Tom? Yeah.
10% of funds payable. So that's basically your grant, and that's the limit in terms of how much you can spend on admin. Yeah.
It's a good question. It's good to clarify, everyone. Okay. I think those are some great questions that came in. We really appreciate all of you joining in today's webinar. We will send out the slides and the worksheets to everyone who attended today, so we really appreciate that, and that you are all interested in getting those materials. So we're excited to of course, share them with all of you. I want to thank John and Tom today for a great presentation. As I previously mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. We will make it compliant for web posting, and then we will post it on the LIHEAP website. It will take a few weeks, but it will be up there, and then that way your teams will be able to access that information, this webinar, at your leisure. So we thank you so much for great participation today, and for being involved with all of our chat questions and the polls, and we hope you like that format. Maybe we can do more of that with future webinars. So thank you again for staying so engaged and joining us today. And of course, follow up with your OCS regional liaisons if you have any questions, and have a great rest of the day.